Down at the National Gallery, we began to talk about Dan W. Turner, an almost exact contemporary of Constable, but different in many ways. And we'll use this brief screencast to talk more about his work, some of the ones that we can see in the textbook, but also some comparisons that are difficult to make in the gallery. One of the primary differences between Turner and Constable is the fact that Turner was actually a Londoner by birth. He was born in the bustling part of London rather than in the countryside, and therefore there's no sense of a personal heritage in his pictures. I think it's also more in tune with certain romantic trends in landscape, in particular the idea of sublime nature, frightening kind of nature that overwhelms our puny attempts to battle against it. We didn't see really much of this at all in Constable's work, where we had a sort of homey cooperation with nature. And so in each of these we see the futility of us trying to tame the seas, the shipwreck on your left from the Tate Gallery in London, or our picture here as these boatmen are trying to cross the bar where the Thames empties into the sea. As you know, major rivers, when they hit the ocean, or maybe you don't know this, but major rivers, when they hit the ocean, there's what's called the bar. And this creates an enormous wake that's incredibly treacherous. People still die trying to cross the bar in major rivers every year. In fact, even today, people still struggle to cross the bar where major rivers empty into the ocean. This is the Columbia River out west where I grew up, and here's a boat trying to cross, and people die there every single year to this very day. And Turner captures the violence of that confluence of rivers and the ocean. Now, like Constable and many romantics, his landscapes are actually indebted to Dutch Baroque landscapes. In another gallery in the National Gallery, we see this image of ships in a gale from the 17th century. Turner had traveled to the continent on a number of different occasions and was really quite enamored with Dutch landscape painting and incorporates that idea of the violence of the sea. For both the Dutch and for the British, the ocean was a significant part of their economy and of their power. And in many ways, Turner's image might be seen as a political allegory, just as Van de Velde's was. Van de Velde's was seen as the ship of state trying to steer clear of the dangers of the rocks. Turner's might be interpreted in a very similar way. In 1807, the Brits were opposing Napoleon and his rise in France. This is where the Thames enters the North Sea. Just across the North Sea, of course, is France. And the Brits were constantly under threat of being attacked by sea for their opposition to Napoleon. And here we see these little boats sort of dwarfed by the power of nature as the clouds spill over. This, I think, has everything to do with contemporary politics and the unsureness of safety at sea because of what's going on with Napoleon across the North Sea. Now, Turner's landscapes aren't always overwhelming in the power of nature as the one that we see here. And also in the same gallery at the National Gallery, we saw a picture of a ferry boat in Rotterdam with a somewhat more calm sea, although you can still see the waves licking up and the wind blowing hard. And again, we see, I think, Turner turning to other forms of Dutch landscape painting, which also showed calmer seas, and where the ferry boat was always seen as a symbol of the journey through life. And I think maybe Turner's picking up on that as well. Although for Turner, so often his landscapes really are a celebration of the forces of nature. We can see how the cloud just simply rages up here as light from the sun spits across the sky in a palpable way. From your textbook, this image by Turner shows his indebtedness to other Baroque landscape painters from his many travels. He's giving us here a very poetic kind of landscape with a mythological theme, and this is based on a painting by the 17th century French artist Claude Lorrain, that was hanging in the Royal Academy in London. And Turner uses his picture as an attempt to rival the old masters, maybe surpass the masters of the past. And in his will, he gives it to the Royal Academy on condition that they hang it side by side with the Clode picture on your left. Now, whereas Constable always struggled to sell landscapes, Turner was incredibly popular. He exhibited every single year in the Royal Academy from age 21 until his death in the 70s. Over 50 years, he was accepted every single year. And part of his success came from the fact that he frequently adopted historical narratives, which was in keeping with the bias of the times. You might remember from the Constable screencast that landscapes with historical narratives were the ones that were considered to be the most important and have the greatest status. And so Turner is not against turning to these from time to time in order to enhance the acceptance and the status of his landscapes. The story here comes from Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil wrote for the first Roman emperor, Augustus. He wrote the story of the foundation of Rome by Aeneas. That's the book called the Aeneid. And it has numerous side stories as well. And in the Aeneid, we read about the Queen of Tyre, Queen Dido, in modern-day Syria, who fled her country where her husband was murdered and founded the city of Carthage in North Africa. So this is what we're seeing here, is that building of Carthage, directed by Queen Dido of Carthage, or of Tyre. Carthage was seen by the Brits in the early 19th century as an analogy for the spread of the British Empire. Britain saw itself as an empire newly constructed after its victory over Napoleon. And what's fascinating about turning to this as an allegory for the foundation of the British Empire and their power taking over is that Carthage would eventually be wiped out by Rome. And so many people think that Turner's picture is both an idea of the foundation of Britain's empire, but also perhaps suggests an uncertain future, kind of like those shipwreck scenes, and really fall into the idea of romantic scenes of human endeavor, being frail. It looks like they're building a great empire here, but if you know your history, you know it will fall. This picture continues the story of Carthage, and you can see that Turner has this tendency of looking directly into the sun. You see this in quite a few of his pictures, where he'll stare at the sun, almost directly at it, and paint it as this force in the sky. Again, it's a historical scene. Again, it continues the story of Carthage. And like many of the scenes, I think that history is played down as he begins to focus increasingly on the power of nature, the force of natural climactic events. I should say climatic events. This shows Hannibal leading the armies of Carthage in a campaign against Rome, where they will in fact fall. Again, this has political significance. This is slightly before the fall of Napoleon. And Hannibal had been criticized by historians for having wasted human life in trying to attack Rome. And Turner focuses on the suffering. If you look in the foreground of the pictures here, you can see the bodies and the struggle of the humans in the foreground. And it's only with great difficulty that you can actually find Hannibal. He crossed the Alps on an elephant, and there you see him deep in the background. Only a small detail here. And many people think this was a jab at Napoleon, a senseless leader, wasting lives in a foolish war to try to take over great empires. Interestingly, Turner had been to France just before Napoleon was crowned. And he had seen the David picture of Napoleon crossing the Alps, where Napoleon, remember, has scratched his name into the rocks next to the name of Hannibal. I think in many ways he's taking that theme and he's flipping it on its ear, saying Napoleon perhaps should not have done this himself. Of course, in Britain, being nationalistic and anti-Napoleon, this picture was hugely successful. They applauded it. It was filled with terrible magnificence. That, again, it's the works of man, Hannibal and his armies versus the power of nature. Now, not every one of Turner's landscapes focused entirely on historical narrative, as we've already seen with those ferry boat scenes and the Thames and Medway. But we also have images that really do focus almost entirely on power of nature, weather and its effects. Turner was known to read the weather reports and seek out storms in Britain just so he could sense how it felt. So here we see a steamboat, which you can only barely make out in the center here, being ravaged by a snowstorm. And what Turner tries to convey here, as well as I think in Hannibal Crossing the Alps, is using the paint itself to suggest the motion and the forces of nature, rather than trying to illustrate the snow. He's instead trying to capture the feeling of it, the way in which it moves. And in fact, the full title of this, when he exhibited it in the Royal Academy, was Snowstorm, Steamboat off a harbor's mouth, making signals in shallow water, and going by the lead. The author was in this storm on the night the Ariel left Harwich. In other words, the steamboat Ariel, the night it left Harwich. So he was there, he claims, and felt the power of this storm as the steamboat leaves the mouth of the harbor. And he's trying to convey to you the power of nature that he himself felt. I think we get that same sense here in this biblical image from the National Gallery. It's not currently on view. How he's trying to capture the sense of that sort of swirling vortex of natural energy. It's worthwhile mentioning for a second his working method. He began many of his canvases and left them somewhat rough and incomplete, these sort of open endings, if you will. He called them his color beginnings. And he'd leave them hanging around the studio in an unfinished state, just sort of with swirls of color. And when he got inspired, he would let the colors that he had originally laid down push him further toward making it into a specific scene. And then, when he put them in the Royal Academy, he would put the finishing touches on them as it hung in the Royal Academy. This was a bit of a push on the normal convention. The day before the Royal Academy opened to the public, they had what was called Touching Up Day, where artists could come in and apply a last layer of varnish based on the lighting of the room so that the pictures would look as good as they could. And this was open to the public as well to watch the artists at work. What Turner did was to apply more paint, which was very uncommon, so his pictures were often wet on the day of the Royal Academy show. And what he would do is he'd look at his picture, look at the pictures that were hung next to it, and then in front of spectators begin to continue painting, if you will. And spectators would flock to see this, and contemporary witnesses, there's one contemporary account that calls him a magician, performing his incantations in public. So a lot of this is done as theater, if you will, artistic theater, almost like a performance at the very last minute. With the National Gallery picture on your left, we have another biblical scene where he's using biblical history to add importance to the landscape. There we see the ark in the distance casting a shadow, and this swirl of birds flying toward it or away from it. But it's little more than an excuse for this rather abstract application of paint across the surface. It really almost looks like an abstract expressionist painting. We see the power of nature symbolized by these aquatic beasts, a crocodile here, other sea monsters that only become apparent as you sort of stick your nose into the picture. Here about to be perhaps rendered extinct by Noah's flood. But at the same time, really, I think his major interest in here, we see more of the ravages. His major interest is this application of paint to suggest the forces of nature, which are so strong as to overwhelm most of the works of man. Indeed, the paint becomes abstract in many passages. We see this in so many of Turner's works, especially the later ones. The most famous of these is the one you might remember from intro class, The Slave Ship, which was inspired by a true story. And here you see the entire title of it as exhibited in the Royal Academy. Slavers throwing overboard the dead and the dying, a typhoon coming on. That gives us the gist of the story. In 1783, an English slave ship from Africa on its way to Jamaica was overtaken by an outbreak of cholera amongst the slaves that it was transporting. The captain had taken insurance on his cargo against the weather, but not against disease. So when he looked to the horizon and saw a typhoon coming on, he threw the 6 slaves overboard, 132 of them, so that he could collect the insurance by saying that they had been lost at sea during the storm. The plot was uncovered when the typhoon passed, leaving the ship entirely unharmed, and it sailed empty into the harbor in Jamaica, and he was then prosecuted. This is again, I think, in many ways, nature overtaking the ravages, or ravaging the works of man. You'll notice here are slave ships, so the sails have been dumped into the ocean. The waves are definitely breaking over the shore, or over the brim of the boat, but it's going to sail through. We see the sun breaking directly behind it. But we also see the shackled hands of the slaves disappearing into the surf as they try and struggle in vain to stay alive. Right, even closer in the foreground, we can see more of these shackles of the hands sticking out, and then in the right-hand corner we can see the leg of one of the slaves, again the shackles on it, and the fish beginning to eat on this as they're gathering to the fresh fruit. This huge, horrific sea monster-like fish in the background swimming forward, probably intended to be a shark. This would make a nice comparison with Copley, wouldn't it, Watson and the shark? Because again, we have this idea of the power of nature being so very strong. And there we can see the degree to which Turner's paint becomes nature itself, where he transforms it like an alchemist into the forces of nature. He commented extensively in his notes on how light itself was something that was palpable, something that you could see was an element. And I think he paints that way as well. Now, this particular story of the slave ship was actually timely when he painted it in 1840. The story comes from 1763, so it's almost 80 years old. But it has to do with recent developments in 1840 about Britain's abolishing of slavery. In 1807, way in advance of America, Britain abolished slave trading. And then slavery inside the British Empire was also outlawed in 1833. In order to continue to push this law, in 1839, the year before Turner painted the slave ship, the British were working to outlaw slavery in other countries and declared that slavers were pirates and international criminals. And to highlight why this was the case, an account of this particular event was published in 1839 as well. So that brought it back to the forefront in people's consciousness. And this is why Turner turns to an 80-year-old subject in 1840. But again, nearly all of the scene seems secondary to his interest in the power of nature, how water and sky meld as he stares at the sun. Our last Turner picture shows again the works of man within nature. Here is a train speeding down a new railway track. He shows us the place where the Great Western Railway crosses a new bridge, a newly built bridge, the Maidenhead Viaduct, which you see here in an internet picture I picked up. It was only built in 1839, so it's a relatively new bridge, and many people saw it as a symbol of modern industry. In fact, a lot of people thought it would collapse, that the spans were too long to continue to stand, but of course it did stand, and it was seen as this great symbol of technological progress. But for Turner, he seems less interested in the viaduct itself than he is with that hurtling train engine, which is just terrific when you see it close up. These splashes of paint, being both the belching steam from the stack, but also the fire of the coal burning that pushes it forward. This picture, in fact, was made after he had sought out a storm. Remember, he liked to read the weather reports and find out where the storms were. He got into a train that entered the storm, and as the train hit the front of the storm, Turner stuck his head out of the window of the train just to experience the force of nature. And this picture seems to pick up on that experience, the sense of the palpability of nature around it, and the sense of wonder of the marvels of technology. There's a couple little fishermen in a boat down here who seem to have paused for a second just to watch the train go hurtling by. I think that's something that we still do, pause to watch these marvels of modern technology. And the train itself, in fact, as it's hurtling down these tracks, and you can see the barriers on either side of it, is actually scaring a little bunny in front of it who's running like hell to get his way out of there. Of course, there's nowhere to go, and if you can't see it, well, there he is, right? There's 2 years. And rendered in a totally Turner manner as he's trying to escape this technological marvel. It's interesting because I think in the hands of Turner, he's so interested in speed and force that nature better get out of the way of the works of man. And it's a very different view of the Industrial Revolution than Constable, where in fact he's almost like he sees it in tune with nature as a marshaling the forces of nature, whereas Constable really tries to avoid technology wherever possible, avoid industry wherever possible, and shows this quiet, quaint way of life where you can hear a dog bark or the waves lap or the sound of a pitcher in the water or a fisherman's line hitting the trees or the ducks quacking. And what Turner gives us is this great cacophony of noise, the wind that blows, the steam engine that hurtles. There's no sense of quiet here whatsoever. So two very different personalities, Constable and Turner, both of them, however, romantic painters in